welcome to another Myths, Mushrooms and Tea episode with myself, John F. White, and
Simon Davis. Hi, everybody.
hello, Simon. So, my question today is, I was reading this book and the first few words in it were, in the beginning. So, what happened in the beginning in your view of the cosmos and universe?
In my view, oh gosh, in my view, I go with the Big Bang model. So in the beginning, my favorite part is there was nothing, which, by the way, is a fascinating way to start this conversation.
Let's start with that. So, what do you mean by nothing? Do you actually mean nothing? If you mean everything's dark, or do you mean everything's light?
Well,
What does nothing look like? Is nothing invisible?
Yeah.
What's
So
going on?
I remember when I was reading the Norse sagas, that for some reason their version of creation sticks out to me more than the other ones, because they really focus on telling you what's not there. So there's no sky, there's no land, there's no stars. So they're just stripping it all away, and they go right, and they slowly reduce it down to the point where they say there's no light. And I think that at that point, as a lot of myths do, they say there is darkness, there is void, there is emptiness. So although that sounds like, they say there's nothing there, I remember in many of the world's myths that this nothing very often involved waters of chaos, darkness, emptiness, and void. So although that's how they described nothing, I always thought to myself, well, those sounds like things. Darkness is a thing. Because with light and dark, darkness can't exist unless there's an absence of light. So then darkness is a thing. You can give it a name, but nothing is that kind of thing. You can't give it a name. There's nothing to name. It's literally like we've tried to give it a name by saying no thing, but it's just absolute. It's like the kind of thing you can't even give a word because no word can quite touch it.
So you have to give words that are the absence of it, which is really interesting for two reasons. One, that is how the other world is described in many myths. It's described as an absence of something. But equally, we have to remember that in the medieval times and before, they didn't understand light. So darkness was in effect worked the same way as light. In effect, you could, if there was such a thing, light a candle of darkness and it would spread darkness everywhere.
Oh, right. So again, it was considered to be a thing, a material thing.
Yeah, rather than an absence of light, it was actually, people felt darkness emanated from something, which is quite interesting.
If you had an illness, it would be blight. It was like a darkness, a sort of black kind of material that would go inside you. I remember hearing about that. So yeah, it was considered a thing.
Yeah, and it is quite interesting that our ancestors, I hear this quite a lot on feedback, started many of their creation stories saying in the beginning there was nothing. Because I hear many people who understand cosmogony, or cosmology, I should call it, think that in the beginning the universe started with nothing, and how our ancestors must have been clued in on the origins of the universe to think that, which I really think is a sort of a misunderstanding of what's going on there. But we can talk about myths in a minute. So, but what I'm interested in, because we've spoken about this before in other conversations outside the podcast, I'd be interested in your view of what happened in the Big Bang. Was it a bang, and what really happened? Do you think in terms of time and space and the like in that first second or minute or
first
whatever?
3 minutes? Is it nucleosynthesis, the first sort of burgeoning moments of the Big Bang? So I've studied this. As you know, I'm writing a myth for the 21st century, and I'm trying to map it onto the actual scientific model, the understanding of how the Big Bang happened. And that's obviously a very materialistic, physicalist point of view. So they are studying things that are tangible, that they can actually record. Like the background radiation of the universe is one of the greatest tools they've used to help us go right back to the very beginning. And I've heard a couple of audiobooks saying that they're very confident that with all the sort of maths they've done, that their understanding of the Big Bang and how it unfurled and how it sort of different things emerged in the early process, that they're very happy that it's accurate, that they haven't made too many mistakes, that from every angle they've tested it at, it keeps on getting the same similar results. So I think if we start right at the very beginning, they have to start with nothing, because they say everything came from nothing. And they typically say this is a point where physics breaks down. We can't explain it. There's nothing there to explain. We don't understand how it started. There's loads of different theories, but there's no actual understanding, because science can't deliver it. So we just got theories.
Yeah,
But
how do you get something from nothing?
something
I guess
from nothing.
That doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, but it does from an idealist or a cosmopsychist point of view. So they've got a way of explaining it, which is interesting. And I've been playing around with it, and I think I've got quite a good grasp on it now. But under that sort of lens, there is a way to explain what nothingness is, and it's an illusion. So there actually isn't nothing in the beginning, according to an idealist or a cosmopsychist point of view. So this is somebody who believes that consciousness is fundamental. They would say that's at the beginning. It is something you can't measure. It's beyond the physical realm. It is pure being. It's everywhere and nowhere. It's so fine you can't record it. You can't test it. And the idea is that it is this consciousness, and from consciousness all things emerge, which is very mythical, isn't it? I mean, how doesn't that sound like something from Egyptian cosmology or something? That the mind gives birth to the cosmos.
It's very mythical. In a sense, you need to be of almost a religious belief to believe that. So from that point of view, it is mythical. It is a religious thought, but it still doesn't get over the fact that how did consciousness get there? And this is one of the things that's always puzzled me. It's sort of the argument for the non-existence of God is that if there was a Big Bang, if there is a God, he must have been there to make the Big Bang happen. But then if there was a start, then what was before the start? So either God has been there for a finite amount of time, or God has been there for an infinite amount of time.
Yeah, and that one makes more sense, doesn't it?
Well, if God's been there for a finite amount of time, then he must have been created.
Yes.
If God's been there an infinite amount of time, we would have never got to the point where he could have made the Big Bang happen.
Well,
because there's an infinite amount of time to get to this point. You could never get here.
In infinity and eternity, they're interesting things, aren't they? Because this idea that things just go on forever. And Roger Penrose is one of my favourite physicists who talks about this. And he's got quite a few models he's tried out. And one of them is a recurring loop. It just goes on and on, so that there is a Big Bang, and then different variations where there could be a big crunch where it all comes back on itself. Or it could be that he's got a very interesting way of explaining it. And I'm not well versed enough to explain it the way he does. But when it all goes dark and all the atoms and all light loses its meaning because there's nothing to see it anymore, there's no observer or observed, and the universe goes cold and dark. What's that called? A heat death, I think.
Oh, the entropy has happened.
Yes. He talks about the fact that there's a possibility that if all things eventually travel to the boundaries of the cosmos and expand to the point where there's a boundary, he explained a way of it all being able to start again. So I'd have to, maybe we can put a video up of him talking about this, so I can take a snapshot of it. But I can't explain it. It's just beyond me. I mean, Roger Penrose's mind is off the scale. But he has got several models, a cyclical model that keeps going on and on for eternity and infinity. And I think he's actually pointed out evidence that dark matter might be something that is a residue of previous Big Bangs. And that dark matter might be this sign that the cosmos keeps going around again and again. And that we actually do have a signature that's still there from a previous universe, and possibly a universe before that, and possibly a universe before that.
Which goes to the same point, which is, when was there a beginning? Or more interestingly, I guess, is time, and whether time's an illusion. Lunchtime, doubly so. That time doesn't exist until there's material in existence to make use of the time.
Yeah.
And therefore, when there's a lack of material, then time resets. So there is no beginning, but that means time has some fundamental rule in it that must exist before the universe. But also, to add to this, while we're talking about darkness, something I heard this week was around the double slit experiment and whether light is actually particles and waves. And some people are now saying that the dark patches in the slit experiment, which sort of separate particles to waves, are actually dark photons,
Right.
which help create the dark matter in the universe, which I'm not entirely convinced with, because I'm sure we must have been able to block them out or something. If that is the case, we would see. But I'm just saying, darkness is as from this candle that lit, spreads darkness idea. Perhaps our ancestors were right. I don't know. It's all very interesting, but time's the really interesting one, and what happens to time at the beginning of the universe, and is the first second of the Big Bang we've talked about before. Does it actually last a second, or does it last a billion years?
Yeah, exactly. I find that idea fascinating. You put me onto that because when I was writing this myth, I was having a little chat with you a year ago, and you said to me, have you included the first couple of seconds? And I said, oh no, well that'll be kind of included when I talk about the first sort of the expansion of the universe. And you said, well no, I think you should really put some attention on that. And when I did, that first 3 minutes is mind blowing. There's so much going on in the first 3 minutes of the Big Bang. It's like a universe in its own right, and it has its own story before everything starts to expand. And in the story I'm telling at the moment, I'm still there. I'm still in nucleosynthesis because it's so complicated. There's so much going on. It's wow. So you touched upon an interesting point just then.
So the time. So do you want to explain the view of 1 second being a billion years, so people understand what that is about? You could use the fly analog or something.
I'll use it. I'll use it. Okay. So if you think of all things, is this from a consciousness perspective? Am I able? Do you want me to sort of put this from a
Tell me wherever you are in
perspective?
the universe at a time you're measuring the time.
Right. Okay.
Although you probably have to be two of you. There'd have to
Right.
be you inside the Big Bang and you outside the Big Bang.
One of the things we have to remember is consciousness is the perceiver of time. So without consciousness, there is no time. If we don't perceive it, then it's like that saying: if a tree falls down in the forest, does it make a sound? With no consciousness to perceive time, we don't even quite know if time makes sense the way it does until you have a person observing it. And where it gets interesting is when you perceive time, it's different for different creatures and different organisms. So there's a time dilation. So most of us experience time on a beat to beat moment, but even we get a weird dilation where you might say some days, God, this day's gone so quick. Where the hell did it go? And it's just gone and the day's over. And then other days you might think it's dragging out and you're thinking, God, I'm really enjoying today. It's only 2 o'clock. I thought it'd be 4 o'clock by now. So you get this sense where it's stretched out. So even on a self-perceiving level, it does seem to fluctuate. But it also between organisms. So I mentioned this once before. If you're trying to swat a fly with your hand, the fly, if it's having a conscious experience, seems to have a time dilation. So you seem to be moving a lot slower. So it's able to move out the way so easily. And if a mountain had consciousness and it was looking down at all the people in a village at the bottom of the valleys, it would see them like little fruit flies moving around very quickly and then disappearing. Like their life cycles are like just a couple of days and they're dead. And then a new cycle comes along of these little fruit fly humans. And it's just seeing it happen at accelerated rates. It's like going. And so the idea is if you can take consciousness down to the level of a fruit fly, and it's experiencing everything more slowly, what happens if you take it down to the level of a cell or the level of an atom? And if they were conscious, then if it gets the time dilation must be insane. So in the first 3 minutes of the Big Bang, you have to ask yourself, if this is from a consciousness point of view, the time dilation could be like an entire universe in its own right. It could be billions of years from its point of view, although we as humans would say, oh, it's only 3 minutes.
Yeah, from outside, if we're looking at the Big Bang, it still goes poof. But if you're inside it, it could be taking forever.
Eons
to happen.
Yeah,
for all those processes, which is interesting. I mean, the other example you used when we talked about it before was a tree, and how trees know what they want to do, but it can take 20 or 30 or 40 years to grow there. They have this totally different perception of time because they live a lot longer than we do. They've got time to do the things they need to do. And that's really, really quite interesting. And we don't see much in terms of time dilation in myths, which is quite interesting. I mean, modern
Well,
myths, we
I don't
talk
know.
about.
Can we say that? Are you sure? I got.
Well,
I can
I'm not
one.
aware. I'm aware of the only time I see time dilation is in the other world. Funnily
That's the
enough, the
one. That's
world.
the one. Yes, that's the
But
one.
but but there's no time dilation. You don't see people having time travel adventures
No,
in
no.
myth. Um, not in what I call myth, not in what I call myth, but the other world. Uh, yes. So the other world uh, is in effect a topsy turvy opposite world to our own. So when the people go to the other world, it feels like a paradise. So heaven is considered paradisical. Paradisical is probably a word. Paradise, and what happens is we think this, and that may have come from the idea of the other world, which is when you go to the other world, you're not hungry because there is no hunger,
Yeah, yeah.
but there's also no food.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
But you're never too cold because there's no cold, but you're never hot because there's no heat. Yeah, and there's all these things going on, and we do see some stories. There's some Celtic legends which are particularly good at this, which talk
Yes.
about people going to the other world or an island,
Tinanog.
off the coast, yes, off
Tinanog.
off the edge of the world, and they come back after 3 days, but actually 30 years have passed.
Do you know the story? Are you quite familiar with the story of the guy who goes to Tinanog? It's a really beautiful story.
Well, the version I know is a slightly different one, but Tirnanog is probably based on the original myths we got from sort of medieval times. But yeah, it's an interesting concept that people, what did people do with that, and did that affect that heaven was a paradise?
Hmm.
I don't know.
It sounds like there's no physical sort of need to eat food, as you said, and the heat doesn't mean anything there. So it does sound like a very idealist view. So when I say idealism, I'm talking about the idea that everything's just mind, and it sounds like it's a realm of just mind because there's no need for the physical consumption. There's no such thing as heat and cold. So it does sound like a realm of the mind, which is eternal according to the Vedanta philosophies in Hinduism and other myths. It's the heavenly realm is eternal. It's a paradise, as you say. So yeah, time doesn't even make sense there. And if it's of the mind, mind is timeless. It's meant to be, as I said a bit earlier, if the mind is something that exists in reality and it's a substrate, it is the one thing that is eternal. It goes on forever and ever and ever, and it doesn't. I don't think it changes. I think it's the one thing that is fixed. It doesn't evolve. Mind is just ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's pure being, and as each of these new universes unfold, and eventually, well, I say life forms. I mean, according to idealism, everything is kind of alive, so it's flowing with life all the way through. But it's eternal, just like Tirnanog and heavenly realms. So yeah, it sounds like that kind of setup, that it's of the mind rather than of the physical.
Okay, that's interesting. So there is the other thing which is quite interesting in myth is the difference between the other world, which we see people talk about, and the underworld, which is where people used to think you go when you died. But people also used to think you went to the other world. But in the underworld, the myths there, we see people go there and come back all the time. Or, yeah, although there's quite a lot of myths. You get this, go to the underworld for a few days and come back, or die for a few days and come back. I mean, Jesus dies for a few days, comes back, same kind of thing. But we see it with many other people. And slightly different versions with Persephone, who goes for half the year and comes back and the like. So that is the difference again between, I think, the other world and the underworld, because it's really hard to find distinguishing features between them. But that is one of them, where the underworld doesn't suffer the time dilution of the other world.
It's also, time very often is used in a different way, because in the hell realms, especially when I think of Chinese and Aztec mythology and Greek, I mean, I don't think Prometheus was in hell, was he? He was taken to a mountaintop and then
Cave, often in a cave for a few days.
So that one doesn't quite work. But in Chinese and Aztec mythology, it's like you get killed, and you every day you wake up and you get murdered. And there's certain realms in Chinese myth where there's different kinds of ways of killing you. So they might boil you to death. They might strip your skin off. They might chop you to 100 pieces. And then the next day you're back again and it happens again for eternity. So there's still that sign. There's still that feeling. It goes on forever, just like in heaven. But it's the cycle itself is horrific. It's something horrifying. It's something that you think, God, this will go on forever. And obviously that gives you the chills that I better not do anything bad in this world because I don't want to end up in eternity.
Yes,
suffering.
That's interesting. I wonder when that happened. Was that post Zoroastrianism?
That one I couldn't say. I mean, yeah, I'd say so. Yes, it would have been,
because that makes sense. So it may have got some Christian influence into that. I mean, the only example of that where that doesn't happen is in Old Norse, where you have Valhalla, where people go, warriors go, and they recycle like that. But until Ragnarok, when they have the eschatological myth of the end of the world and everything's reset again.
Yeah, that's brilliant, isn't it? That Norse. You can explain this to me better than I understand it, because I've looked at the end of Ragnarok, and I noticed that after many and many of the gods died, and the Yggdrasil was burnt, and many of the lands were disconnected, that the Earth realm continued. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's a resurrection, isn't there?
Yes, a tree. And two individuals come from the children. I think the children of Thor. I don't know. Yes,
isn't one of them the light god who got killed by Loki? Doesn't he not make a comeback?
No.
Balder, yeah. Okay.
No.
Okay.
Not in the versions I've read anyway. But yes, we do get say it's a rebirth of the world, and it starts again. And there's multiple winters that happen in the cycle, and some people think that actually may relate to geological events in Scandinavian history, where you have these cycles. Some feel it's every 700 years or so. There seems to be a cycle where everything gets really cold and really bad. That may just be coincidence or whatever, but they feel that may well have influenced these stories that, everything's bad, we got better, everything's getting bad again, it will get better again. Yes, fascinating.
There's a saying, isn't there, in not less myth but more mysticism, as above so below. So the idea that the entire universe is contained inside a single cell or in a single organism or a single planet. It's that the entirety of the cosmos itself and the way it works is reflected in the macro scale, or the micro scale, sorry, where you can even atoms are meant to behave in a certain way.
I think most people have had the thought, well, what if we are just like there's a world on the atom of a thumb, that I'm in, or I'm just on the thumb of a giant or whatever. There's all these weird feelings. It is, yes. I mean, you do look for those patterns, and I think it just comes down to how nature works. There are rules of nature. Nature cycles things.
Which, this is what I was going to say, that the cycles, you can find cycles everywhere. The cosmos has a cycle, planets have cycles, suns have cycles, organisms have cycles. Everything works to this fundamental sort of principle that things work in a cycle. So then why not the cosmos itself? If everything within the cosmos is, follows that principle, then why not from entropy. A mythological point of view?
Oh, from a myth, maybe, but from a science point of view, and entropy, things just will dissipate and to nothingness.
Do you subscribe to the idea that eventually we will expand to darkness, cold, the heat death will happen, and that nothing will recycle, nothing will reform, it will just go into this state of nothingness? Well, obviously not nothingness, everything will still be there, but dark and cold with no light.
But it's so spread out. Well, that is really interesting. So on the proviso that our universe is inflating in a way that it will not stop. Because if it does stop, then it would make sense that it would then deflate and go back and recycle. So if it wouldn't do that, you have to ask yourself how big the universe is, and is there actually an edge to it?
Because is it infinite? I mean, yeah.
Because there's a difference between the 14 billion light years we know of the age of the universe, which means it's 29 billion light years across. However, when we observe the universe, it's nearer 80 light years across, 80 billion light years across, because of expansion in the Big Bang and this sort of time dilation going on. But even then, is that really the end of the universe? Because most of our observations say the universe is flat. And if we look outside our kitchen window at night, it certainly doesn't look flat. It looks huge.
Yeah.
So why do they think it's flat? The only way it could be flat if we're looking at 1 degree of 1 degree of 1 degree of a large sphere of the universe. And we're just looking at that little line, and that's the universe is flat. And in fact, it's a part of the circumference of a larger cosmos.
Have you seen the map of the known universe? There's everything we can possibly see has been mapped now. And I saw a gentleman yesterday. He was just showing you the most distant galaxy in the entire universe that just makes it into our map. So it's right in the fringe, but it just keeps on going. And when you see how big this model is, you're like, how can this thing be even bigger than this? And it keeps on going. And there's 3 ideas that I can think of. One is that it's infinite. It doesn't stop. It keeps going. Second one is, as you say, it's flat, which I think is where most the physics and maths is pointing towards. It's a flat, almost like a flat galaxy. It's got that kind of breadth to it, but it doesn't have the depth. And then Roger Penrose posits a very interesting one where he says when they do the mathematics to prove it's pretty much looking like it's flat, there is this tiny, tiny, tiny little curve he's measured that he says if you extrapolate that curve, it might actually be the universe is so big. It is actually it's a sphere, but it's so big that curve isn't a line. It's actually a massive, huge, super expansive universe. So big it would boggle your brain even trying to think about it. And ultimately nobody knows. We just don't know.
But then, how can you have a Big Bang? Because the Big Bang is just a dot on a minor part of the circumference of a huge circle. What's going on there?
How can everything be pushed down into that dot? But apparently,
exactly. But it's so big, it hasn't had time to expand into the size of the universe we think the universe is. So have there been multiple Big Bangs far away from each other? And it's just a natural thing. Is the Big Bangs happening all the time in an infinite, near infinite space?
Does that resonate with you? Because I'm interested in, because we don't know, and we were in the realm of you have to take the facts that you're given by science, but then science says, look, we're not 100% sure. There's quite a lot of ideas and variations. So sometimes it comes down to instinct and resonance, what feels, and again, this is feelings. I know facts don't care about your feelings, but at this point you can go with feeling. You can go with intuition because there's not a lot else.
We can on this podcast. Yeah.
Yes. Does that cyclical model resonate with you? Because for me, because everything else in the universe obeys those laws, I can't help but think it just makes sense. The universe itself then follows the very law, and it's just a fractal.
Well, yes and no. So yes, for what you say, most of my life I felt the universe would be recycling. But if that was the case, it wouldn't have such a unique beginning. If something can have a unique beginning, it can have a unique end.
Okay.
And therefore doesn't have to recycle. So because it's already done something quite special, there's nothing to say that it should then follow all the laws of physics that are happening during its lifetime before it dies. But we won't know what happens at the end of the universe unless we get a ticket to Millie Ways, to eat some food and dine at the restaurant at the end of the universe.
Oh, I love that. I love that scene. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Do you remember the bit where
the cow?
The cow. It was a pig. It might be a kind of cow pig. It might be a hybrid.
Yes.
And it goes, "Would you? Hello, everybody. This is from the BBC. If nobody's seen the BBC version, it's better than the movie. So, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I highly recommend you watch that. And that pig cow thing, it comes in. It says, "Would you like to eat my trotters? I've been covering them in all sorts of honey juices to make them very succulent for you." And everyone's going, "I don't want to eat you. Oh my God, you're still alive. Why would you want me to eat you?" And he goes, "Well, I've been designed for you to eat me, and I want you to enjoy me. That's what I've been made for. If you don't eat me, I will have no purpose. What's the point? I'll feel terrible." It's just a brilliant scene.
Weird twist on that. They're absolutely brilliant. Yes, but the whole point in many ways is you put £1 in your dollar in your bank account, and then you go to Millie Ways, and that dollar, through interest over billions of years, has become enough to be able to pay for the food.
I need to listen to that book again. Yeah, brilliant.
Absolutely brilliant. But yes, so yes, I don't know what happens at the end is probably as intriguing as what happens at the beginning, because if it does just dissipate and go off into nothingness, it isn't. It's actually going on to the other parts of that big circle we're talking about. It's part of
Yeah,
and
yeah.
joining up there. And perhaps if enough of that happens and comes together, it creates a big bang.
But possibly that sounds a bit like what Roger Penrose would say. I think that sounds like one of his
He's copying my
ideas.
ideas. I'm very
Yes, yes.
disappointed. I'll have a word with young Roger. Yes, that does fascinate me. But let's talk about myth a second, because that's the other thing we do in the beginning of the universe. And when we see myths where they say in the beginning there was nothing, there was no light, there was no dark even. But we do often see in some of the earliest myths. So that is a view that our ancestors thought land came from the sea.
Mm.
So land was created, which is. Do you think that there must be some psychological view on that? Why we think that water didn't rain on the land, which we do see in some myths, like the rainbow serpent and the rain snake of South Africa. We see a snake live on a dry land, carve it out as it writhes around, and then says, "Let there be water," and water comes. But actually, most of our creation myths are the world was sea, and then land happens for a reason. So why? Do you have any views on that? Why as humans we think that?
I like looking at it as an evolution. So I'm interested in, as you are, how the Stone Age people had a creation story that was very similar, and then when we got to the agricultural age, there was there was alterations and new ideas being sort of formulated, and especially when we get to the Bronze Age and Iron Age, then even more sophisticated ideas. So I'm very interested in the evolution of how that worked. But as you say, the oldest versions, it was the earth diver was a common one, wasn't it? Going the bird or an animal would go underwater and bring the land up, and the idea was at that point the universe was just water and sky. I think they just said that was all there was.
Well, exactly. And on the land, a tree would grow and push the sky up, and that became a pillar in other stories, or mountains, things that push up the sky. And in the very earliest creation myths, we see humans come from the underworld and out the tree. That's probably really the oldest of myths. And then that bird that dives down. Eventually, in Asia, the creation myths change into flood myths, and that bird becomes a bird like the bird scout motif, which we see in Noah's Ark. But we see in many other creation myths where the bird flies off to bring land back, or to bring proof of land back.
Yeah.
So we see this development of that creation myth. But as you say, the creation myth then changes, and probably the biggest change is the primordial twins of the Indo-Europeans.
Yes.
Where one sacrifices a twin to build the world. However, if you look at some of the creation myths with water, such as the Enuma Elish, whilst we sort of have twin serpents, one of them is killed to create
Tiamat and
the world.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a sort of, when do we go from water serpents to primordial beings? And I think that's a societal change. So the Near East is obviously surrounded by water. There's lots of water on the Mediterranean. The Persian Gulf would have been. The Persian Gulf may not have been in place actually when the Enuma Elish was written. It was, but certainly at the time of the Fertile Crescent, there was probably no Persian Gulf. That happened at about 15,000 years ago, 14,000 years. So. But there was a lot of water, so I can understand why they took that. And you've got the Tigris and the Euphrates as key water sources in that region. But with those without water, that primordial sea myth may not have stuck. But if they've got these twin figures, then the question is, did the primordial serpent myth find its way into the Indo-Europeans and they changed it into people? Or is it older than that, and they changed it into people long before that because they were away from water, because they lived, in Siberia or Central Asia, and there was less access to huge rivers and seas. I mean, there are them there, but not to the there's no ocean, there's no Mediterranean.
If you
This
think
side
of
of it.
the Aboriginal creation stories, very often they actually say everything came from the land underground, didn't they? So they're looking more at as rather than the water. And this is also an ancient story, so it's a bit of a change from the one we were just talking about. But they say that the womb of the earth itself is the realm of creation, and all things came out of the womb of the earth, and that would involve things like Bame, who's one of the sky god, the serpent, the rainbow serpent came out, and then the spirit of the kangaroo people and the spirit of the, I don't know, the Tasmanian devil. Yeah, all these different spirits would come out of the womb of the earth, and you can, in a weird way, think of the embryonic waters as a sort of like a creative substance. We noticed obviously when children are born that the waters came out of their mother's womb, so that we must have thought to ourselves, waters are very profound for us, and water, when creation happens with a new child, there is water. Without water we all die, so they must have thought as water as being an essential quality that women obviously as well embody in their own form, as I said with pregnancy, with the waters breaking. So there's something embryonic about water. There's something magical. It's vital. Without it, you die. So it's interesting that they thought, even with the womb one, where it comes from the land, there's still the idea of the nurturing fluids of the mother, the womb itself. And then with a story where the earth diver goes underwater and finds the land, it's the water itself is one of the earliest things. It's one of the most important and nourishing and vital elements in the entire cosmos. So it's interesting they selected those ideas and those sort of motifs for the Big Bang, as if it plays an important role. Yeah, I'm not going to go any further than that because I've got some crazy ideas, but I'm not going to quite go
That's
yet.
right. So yes, I mean I've heard the rainbow serpent just say was on dry land and it made it water go, and then people came up from the ground and the animals came up. So I've heard that. I haven't heard that the rainbow serpent came up from the ground with those animals. I'll have to look into that.
There's so many inflections when you study Aboriginal myths. It's inflections all over the place.
But how do you find out which was the first? That's the hard,
Yeah.
and that's what I mean. I have to say that's what's really hard about understanding myths, especially those from, let's say, Africa, which probably have. You'd like to think some of our oldest myths and some of our oldest language, but we just don't have the data to be able to prove that they are. So we don't know. We could go down into Central Africa and hear a story that could be 200,000 years old, potentially. But we would never know that. We can't assume it's any older than the person telling the story. It's just, it's a really frustrating place to be, to have lost all that cultural sort of information. It's very frustrating. But yes, water, I feel it's, I don't know if you ever sail or if you go to the sea, it's just an immense, weird place with a different world inside it as well. So they must have, swam in the water and dived down and saw fishes. I mean, you go to the tropics or whatever. It's just a very different world. I mean, if people dived in Poole Harbour in southern England, you'll see 6 feet in front of you and you don't think water's very special and full of life. But I mean, dive in the Caribbean and it's beautiful. So I'd imagine that may have influenced some of the storytelling, certainly around Australia and in the tropics. That made sense that water would have that, and that may be one of the influences why it didn't have that. When you go outside the tropic areas and go more north, where there was water, it's just that it didn't necessarily have the same magical view of holding life and the like that we see now. That's a view.
I find it interesting as well that as our ancestors went through certain epochs where things would change, so the agricultural age, that's when they kind of start to unlock the cycles of nature and they start to really focus. I mean, you can see when you pull right back and you're observing it from a sort of anthropological, historical point of view, you see them thinking in different ways. They start to realize, they discover new sciences, like they can affect animals by breeding them a certain way, and they can turn wolves into dogs, and they can turn grasses into grains and grains into bread and start creating new foods and so on. and they start to understand the mechanics of nature. You know, when to sow the seed, when to harvest the crop, how to put it aside for the winter to survive the cold period and to make sure you have food. That's a technological advancement, but then you start seeing it reflected in our myths, where we start talking about cycles. And I wonder if that's where the first ideas of the universe being cyclical came from. Once our ancestors unlocked the idea of nature being cyclical, and they were, I mean, yeah, I wonder if that's where
Yes,
the myths
absolutely.
start
I
to
mean,
evolve.
I would say that. I mean, the cycle of life is, is an obvious thing to see,
Hmm.
and it's a thing you have to respect and consider sacred. Amongst certainly our early farmers.
Hmm.
I mean, in a way that, I mean, you have to respect it now, otherwise we'll all die out overnight. But I don't think it has the same sacredness today
Yeah,
that
yeah,
it
yeah.
did 10,000 years ago. So yeah, I certainly think things come and go, and that is the Indo-European creation myth. So where we talk about creation myths starting in the dark with the primordial ocean, the Indo-European one doesn't really have that per se.
Hmm.
It sort of just talks about two primordial twins out of nowhere, and one kills the other.
Hmm.
And when I tell this story, I sort of make something up to give it a sense of context in an empty cosmos. One kills the other to create the world. But because they've used the body to create the world, and then from that body, they've also created the first people, when the people die, they hold the material that used to belong to the world, so their body goes back into the world. But equally, when people are born, they take from the world the materials from the world. And so the world will run out of material. That was a concept that the early Indo-Europeans had. And so that's why they sacrificed, because they wanted to give things back to the world. If things didn't seem right, the balance wasn't right, or to keep things in order, which is probably a better way of phrasing it, to keep the cosmic order of things, they would sacrifice things to make sure that the earth had enough material to keep providing cows and
Hmm.
horses and people and the like.
If that's an Indo-European, was do we know whether sacrifice was happening before the Indo-Europeans? I read before. I can't remember where it was in England. They found a skull cap that may have been filled as a drinking vessel, and they think that person may have been sacrificed, and that could have been like 7,000 BC or 8,000 BC from memory. But how far back do we think the idea of sacrificing not just animals but humans as well to try and placate this sort of, so that, just get this straight, the idea is that if they don't do that, then the world could be eaten away, and they've got to give
Mm-hmm.
back to keep that. Again, it's a cycle, isn't it? Just if we take,
Yes.
we have to give back to maintain a cycle, right? Okay, how far back do you think it goes then, John?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I haven't ever thought about that. Now, I would say it would have happened post sedentary behavior. So I think humans must have settled by the time we considered sacrifice, because it's only when we're in a community and we have desires that can't be met by wandering off, because we can't wander off anywhere like hunter gatherers. We're
Hmm.
stuck in that. We have to make a decision: what do we do in our community to appease the situation? And this is how religion crops up and gods crop up. Oh, we haven't got the animals we need; they're not here. We must have upset the animal god. So let's appease the animal god. How do you appease the animal god? You create some kind of attributes that God has, and some needs, and
Hmm.
you fulfill them. And some gods are happy with a goat, some are happy maybe with a gerbil, but some want some humans.
Yeah.
I would say it's definitely sedentary behaviour. Definitely, probably from around, well, maybe as late as, or as early as 15,000 years ago, when we first started settling. I mean, if you go to places like Göbekli Tepe,
Hmm.
you'll see that on top of some of the pillars and outside the main settlement, there's stoneworks which have lots of holes carved in them, or
Oh.
sorts of small holes, which is said by many of the people who are local to the site were used for sacrifice and were
Right.
filled with blood.
Hmm.
Can't say
Okay.
there's much evidence of that myself. I'm a little skeptical. What you find often is that if you want to carve a big hole in a bit of stone, you make lots of little holes and then you break the little holes together. And that's a lot quicker than carving one big hole in at one time. So it could be that it was a process towards something else and it stopped.
And you've been there. You've seen
Yeah.
Göbekli Tepe with your own eyes. That's the interesting.
I have, yes.
Did the holes? Did you see the holes?
Yes. Oh, yeah, saw the holes.
Did they look like? Just to quickly check now. Did they look like maybe a spear kind of stab kind of hole, or did they look like a deliberately made kind of hole?
Deliberately made hole. These are holes in stone. They're probably 2 to 4 inches deep, maybe a couple of inches wide, 2 or 3 inches wide. And there's loads of them at the tops of the hole. And I say outside on some flat stonework, there's lots. Now, if on the top of the columns these holes were used to fill with blood, that would seem odd because we know that Göbekli Tepe sites were covered; they had roofs. So to get to why put blood in the holes if the roof was covering them, or I think more likely is that the roof didn't cover the top of the pillars. The top of the roofs came down slightly below the top of the pillars because we see pole holes. It looks like pole holes in the T-piece of the pillars at the bottom. So it could be that the roof didn't cover and let the top part show. But then in which case, how did you get to the top part to put the blood in because there's a roof in the way? And even if you did, what's the point?
Well, yeah.
I mean, what is it? Is it that you wanted birds to fly and sit on the top of the pillars and that was good? And it could be. You don't know.
Just to add an extra sort of angle on this as well, the Aztecs were sacrificing on an industrial scale, weren't they? When they were discovered by the conquistadors, they were shockingly like hundreds, if not thousands, of people.
Yes. Okay. So let's set the record straight on that as well. So because we see that again in Germanic tribes do that, and like in Europe, and the reason seems to be purely one of resources. If you've captured 50 people and you're a tribe of 200, do you feed the extra 25% of people or do you not feed them?
Yeah.
And if you can't afford to feed them, what do you do with them? Well, you might as well give them to someone who would be grateful. So you sacrifice them to the god of whatever beer making or whatever you wanted to do that night to do it. So basically we often see, whilst human sacrifice is seen as a tribute to particular gods, it is often done as a way of controlling resources, certainly in a battle situation or hostage situation.
Okay. So it's a convenient way to sacrifice lots of people to appease your god because they're just
kill two birds with one
slaves.
stone.
And that practice wasn't just in the Aztecs, because I was reading. I find it sometimes disturbing. It's one of the few things that gets to me when I read about human sacrifice. It's just ooh. But I was reading about the Native Americans in North America also sacrificing. And I was trying to figure out, was it there once they'd already gone into the Americas? So they were doing it for as long as 18,000 years ago when they were first going in. Or had it migrated in on one of the later waves and then been introduced? Had it got to South America via maybe the Polynesians and then travelled northward into California where they started practicing it? I don't know. I'm just interested in how far back it goes, because if they carried it in with them, it could be 20,000 years old, if not older.
So the sacrifice. So I guess what the other thing we should respect. That's a good point. So one thing, just to clarify on the getting rid of resources, the reason we know that is that we often find that if we captured the leaders of armies or something like that, they were not sacrificed. They were kept and bartered with. So we understand it's a resource thing. It's a resource thing. So what we, I think, and then this may be an unpopular opinion, is because I would like to think, I study myths and I see these myths dispersed all over the world, and certainly the Indo-European ones I'm very familiar with, but they some across Eurasia. I'd like to think, how does everyone know the same story? Yeah, or it gets pretty much. And I have this romantic view that there's these hunter-gatherers like skipping around the landscape, enjoying life, and they bump into each other and say, hello, let's tell a story and share stories and move on. But I am actually And I used to think like that, but now I'm 90% sure that if that happened, they would just kill each other. I think
Oh,
humans,
from the having the difference of ideas and
yeah,
ideologies.
different,
So
different.
ideological warfare as far back
Yes,
as then.
well, you're stealing my resources, so I'm going to kill you so I can have the cave bear to myself and the berries. So I think, and we do see a lot of war, a lot of injuries in human skeletons in archaeology. More so than is a standard accidents happening at home, so to speak. These people are deliberately killed. So I think we are a naturally violent species, irrespective of where we are on the planet. Terrifyingly so. And I think it's certainly the hunter-gatherer days uh, where we don't have the issues of having to make a god happy. We have to make ourselves happy by making sure we've got food to eat. And if we see someone stealing our food or in our place, I think we would have killed them. Now, the question is, do we just kill them or do we capture them and then kill them in a very specific way? So is there a ritual about it, a sacrificial ritual? And I don't think we see enough evidence of repeated injuries across archaeological finds, purely because there probably just isn't enough data to suggest that there is ritualistic behaviour in the killing of people in sort of the Paleolithic period. So I think we'd like to kill people because there is a need to do that in order for resource or even in hunger issues. Oh look, there's like your dad's really large here, make a meal for us. Kill him. But yeah, I feel, yes, we killed people, but not necessarily for religious intent or ritual, but just for our own well-being until we got to the Neolithic period where we had more, where we blamed gods far more for things.
In the Norse myths, I noticed that there's I can remember Odin talking at one point, and he's talking about how important it is that when a stranger comes into your realm, that you show them great hospitality, and there was like a ritual of hospitality, if you like. So that in a time where we know that the Norse people did do human sacrifice and animal sacrifice, there's this sense that they're not killing. There wasn't a fear of this person could be coming to steal my food. It's like they were saying, if a stranger comes in, let's bestow upon them kindness and the hope that they're going to treat us well, and if not, then maybe if they're our enemies, we have to fight them. But do you think that we were a bit more savage back then, or do you think there was an etiquette of trying to avoid fighting and killing, and sometimes we just couldn't avoid it? Or do you think, because I guess what I'm trying to say is maybe it wasn't so savage. Maybe there was an etiquette to try and avoid that, and a human desire not to kill as well. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so you're talking about the Havamal, which is a sort of a book of proverbs from the Viking Age, and it's most of it's as true today as it was when it was written, and it's probably 1,000 years old, but it's written sort of in the 1300s. Now, life in Scandinavia was hard. It was really hard. It's not a suitable country to grow crops in very easily and things like that if you look at the landscape. So I feel that populations were small enough and trade was significant because there's a lot of rivers in Scandinavia. So I'd imagine there's a lot of boat trade going around that people sort of knew each other or were aware of families and the like. So I think there was an adoption of, if someone appears reasonably friendly and we sort of half know them, then we'll show them some respect, and care for them, keep them warm and feed them. But I'm sure if a foreigner, not a stranger, but someone they considered was not part of their cultural group or came along, they would treat them quite differently.
Okay, yeah.
Although I've got no proof for that, but it was because how we see Vikings fight and the Old Norse fight. They again took no prisoners really. Yeah, unless
that's right.
for
Yeah.
negotiation they killed. So yeah, I think it was very much they became very familiar with their own, and it's that kind of behaviour and some of the things written by Tacitus that unfortunately gives people who try and follow those religions today, reconstruct them, a real bias on who are the best people and things like that. That's it's absolute nonsense to feel like that. It's I won't get into that too deeply here, but yeah, it's frustrating that people misread that. It was just that the times were hard. Your resources were slim.
So we can extend that to all tribes, can't we, around the world? Then
Yes.
in many ways, it may have been hard, unless you're living in a really abundant area where food is just growing out of the ground. And then maybe there's less hardship and less desire to fight. But
Exactly, and you see that in the medieval period and when agriculture has really taken off, people aren't just naturally going around killing each other.
Yeah, warfare drops down, doesn't it? Whenever there's abundance, war goes down. When there's scarcity, war goes up. I like the idea you were saying. I'm more towards when you were saying that when we spread these myths around, that we were meeting each other more amicably. So how did you put it when we would start prancing around?
Exactly, skipping around and bumping into people in the nature. Hello, mate. You'd like to say, yeah.
One of the things, when strangers come, I guess there's two kinds of strangers. You can have the wandering stranger with a weapon who comes in secretively and you're thinking this could be a threat. But then, of course, you get the merchants who will bring in stories and items and food, and of course it's like my daughter goes nuts when the ice cream van comes and it's like, oh my god, the ice cream van's here. It must have been similar in those days where a trade merchant came in. You're like, oh my god, what have you got, show us your wares. And they say we've got stories. And in South America there's a character called Copper Kelly, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and he was a merchant and a traveler, kind of spirit god. He reminds me a little bit of Pan for some reason. He had these kind of like protrusions coming out of his head, a bit like the horns, and he was a festive kind of spirit. And he would bring trade. He'd bring so many goods, and people loved him. And he also had stories. He'd spread the myths around. So I'd like to think that was also a dynamic. So maybe it was a bit of both. The trades and merchants maybe were treated better, and then a wandering warrior maybe less so, a bit more. Especially like you say, in areas of scarcity, it's a bit more dangerous, and in areas of abundance, it's a bit safer.
Indeed. I would like that, because how else were stories spread unless they're just spread by the most successful warriors? But then you would expect the stories to be weighted that way, and I'm not yet in a place to say whether they are or not, but soon.
Okay, so I've got a question for you then. Going back to this model of the tradesmen and these I think they were probably the bees of culture that cross pollinate, all these different ideas around these merchants.
It's a good analogy. Yep.
So one of the myths, the creation myths, going back to the beginning again. So I'm bringing us back in a cycle. One of the myths that developed, I don't know whether it was the agricultural times or whether it was more the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, but the myth about where we start to see in the beginning there was darkness, nothing, the waters of chaos, and then out of that came a seed or an egg or a hill rises out of the waters of chaos. Yep. And then from that one thing, like the egg that Pangu was inside, for instance, in Chinese mythology, when that cracked open,
or Ptah in Egypt, yeah.
You've got it. And then all of creation takes place. How far back do you think that mytheme, that kind of opening goes to? Because I haven't quite pinpointed that yet. I mean, I haven't.
No, that's a tough one. That is a tough one. I don't think it's Paleolithic, but that's only. I think it's more a Neolithic myth. Yes. But I can't quite put my finger on it. I can't, because it didn't influence Indo-Europeans, but we see it in Egypt and we see it in Asia, and the Indo-Europeans were in the middle of it, and yet we think the Indo-Europeans influenced Pangu, and the Indo-Europeans certainly influenced some of the Near Eastern myths, as did the Near Eastern people influence some of the Indo-European myths. It would suggest that it's may have come perhaps it could have come from somewhere like Turkey or Anatolia, spread out, and then was removed from that region and just stayed on the outskirts of it.
Because that could go back to 5,000 BC, maybe.
Maybe 8 or 9, 10,000
Okay.
BC. But that's all speculation. I haven't done enough work on that yet, but we are getting there. There's lots of work going on with the mythology database that will hopefully do this. So just to give you a little update, actually, if people are interested here. So I'm now extrapolating data from the narratives using some whole load of infrastructure I set up. And whilst the mythology database has around 13 categories, of which we've got 3,300 motifs, in there we've got over 200,000 myths. Those 200,000 myths have created around 30 million mythemes.
God. I didn't realise there's that many.
So,
oh my God.
yes, I've only just literally in the last couple of hours got that data. I mean, I was hoping it would be about 500,000, but no, it's exceeded my expectations, which is a near impossible amount to manage. But I'm trying to semantically align them to see if I can find duplicates semantically and reduce that number to maybe 29 million or something.
Wow.
Yeah. So we are.
That shows you the power. That shows the power of mythemes. How they are all invasive. They're ubiquitous. They travel. The inflections go all over the place. It just shows you the power of myth. It's incredible.
But if I get those, my view is that if I can say which one of these represent cosmic eggs or something, then we get a really good idea of which stories they are and their dispersal. And that's the aim of that. So one day I'll have an answer for you, Simon.
All right.
Episode 20 or something.
I've got I want you to have a little think about this, because this is something that interests me. In writing a myth, that I've called it the omni-myth for those who aren't aware. It's the 21st century sacred narrative. I'm looking back at the ancestors' interpretations. So one of my goals is to use all of the mythemes and all of the images and the metaphors that they used, and then trying to apply it on the actual Big Bang itself.
All the mythemes.
Yes, as many. Well, now you've told me there's like how many million. I'm not so sure now. You've scared me now. I'm not sure I can do this like in my lifetime. But yeah, there's obviously there's a hierarchy of mythemes, and some of them are incredibly prominent. The cosmic egg being one of the major ones. The cosmic tree. They're huge. So I noticed when I read that version that our ancestors started to develop, the idea that so going back to Pangu's egg, when that egg cracks open, Pangu comes out and all the material universe was inside that egg, and then he starts to separate it into the some of the yolk, the lighter yolk he puts to the heavens, the heavier yolk he puts down to the earth, and then that creates a sort of like the stage upon which the cosmos will be made. But then he actually then dies. I don't think it's a self-sacrifice as much as he just dies from being absolutely knackered from separating the heaven and earth, and then his body goes on to become the entire material cosmos. It's one eye becomes the moon, one eye becomes the sun, and then as we know, same with Umir and Prusa, their body parts become the entire cosmos. So I noticed that you could call that an inflection. I mean, maybe you disagree with me, but many of the world's myths have an egg. So the Finnish mythology, there's a bird that lays an egg, and the entire cosmos comes out of that one egg. Is that right? In the
Calavella, but
which I know is a new myth. Yeah,
it is a combination of pretty much. It is a hybrid myth, more modern one, which would upset any Finnish listeners because they are very passionate about it. But it is a myth that has been pulled together from various myths, so you've got a real hybrid of things going on there.
Was that written in the 19th century or the 20th
19th century, yeah.
Look at that. So that's an actual, can we actually call that a myth, a sacred, they believe the sacredness of it?
It's a compendium of myth and folk tales. And we find that, so we find in Eastern Europe especially, a lot of folk tales have elements of myth in them because there was a heavy Christian influence in there. but because they didn't necessarily have uh, the vast expanse of what do you call it, influence from cities, rural areas were allowed to keep their own beliefs. So folklore persisted whilst you got this overarching Christian belief. So much of the folklore was changed to include God and the devil rather than the original characters. That's why you get saints being the names of old gods and old believers, that they're sort of pulled in to make people tell the stories with the right names and such. So, yeah, you find this weird hybrid mix all over. It's also in Finland, into Hungary. Funny enough, the same people that have travelled from Finland, Hungary go to Finland. But you also see that in Eastern Europe, like Romania and Albania and Bulgaria. We have these myths in there.
Amazing. Okay, I haven't read that all the way through yet, but it's interesting to think that somebody actually has written a myth for the 19th century that when they wrote it, they may have been considering it as possibly sacred. Would you say? Because that's the main.
No, not sacred. They just wanted to have an epic. So what really happened? You can blame Piccolo for this. The Pope turned out, I think, it turned into Pope Pius II, and he was looking for some of Tacitus's work, and he discovered Germania or Germania, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which talked of what Tacitus documented in Germany, what you call Germany now, at the start of the first millennium, so 2,000 years ago. And up until that point, most cultures in Europe and the Mediterranean thought that Rome and Greece, Egypt, these were key golden civilizations from where everybody came from. Everyone else was a barbarian. But then Pope Pius, he gets this document and sees that actually, no, the Germanic tribes weren't barbarians. They actually had order and culture. Treated their families with respect. And this made the Germans think, oh, no, we have our own civilization. We aren't the barbarians. We were good. And then the old Norse poems pop up, the Eddas pop up, and it shows, oh, no, the Vikings had this great poetry, incredible poetry that people wanted to copy. And then obviously Finland's next door and doesn't want to feel left out. And we actually sort of see this nationalism build up. And this is where we start seeing this nationalistic view, certainly across Europe, that people need their own foundation stories and creation myths. Certain the oldest places had them, like England had them in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, and Rome's got it with Romulus and Remus. But we see these places that didn't have it build up their own stories, and this builds up nationalism. And there's a really weird link between people who studied folklore in the 18th and 19th century and sort of national pride and what amounted to even political parties and political people coming from those to try and create independence for particular regions. And
it does show you when people are trying to get a sense of unity and to define who they are and to say, well, what makes us separate from these people, they go to their myths. It's like, again, it's so universal, they're so ingrained in our psyche that people that's like a go-to area. And it's interesting now. I mean, nationalism seems to be on the rise again. And I do wonder if you'll start to see people going back to the myths again. I wonder. It's interesting.
Luckily, I don't think we're quite as religious as we used to be. But you're right. But the thing is, it didn't matter what the myth said, providing there was a myth there saying whatever it is you wanted to believe. I think I said that in the last podcast. I explained the creation myths of Europe, that there aren't that many. They're all basically the same, but just change the details. So actually, the main plot of the myth doesn't matter. You just need and at the end, this country exists or our gods exist. That's all people want to hear. They don't really care about the rest, which is, again, quite weird. Why people just need that to have belief in themselves and what they want.
I got to be honest with you, in a weird way, as I'm getting older, I'm showing a lot more interest in Celtic mythology and Welsh mythology and looking at Welsh culture, because I've noticed, Britain is changing. We've got so many migrants coming in now that you can see the trajectory that we could change. We could become a different country with different cultural influences, and it makes you then sort of go, so my what was my culture? What exactly could be changing? And if it's changing, is there anything you want to keep from it? And I've just noticed how much I really love Welsh culture, and I want to go to the Eisteddfod this year to see a lot more of the Welsh singers and the Welsh harpists, and there's Welsh storytellers there. So I just thought, yeah, it makes me want to embrace my own culture a bit more, to see. I can't explain it. It's because you feel like your culture's changing. I've just noticed myself looking towards Welsh culture with a little bit more of a, what's the word, nostalgic way.
Yes, I mean that's interesting because obviously the Welsh and I'm going to upset half of Britain now, well, most of it, but the Welsh and the Cornish are Britons. They were living in Kent, for example, 2,000 years ago. It's only when the Romans come along and changed the culture in Britain and pushed some away, and then the Anglo-Saxons come along and really pushed them away into Wales and Cornwall and the like, that those Britons decide to call themselves Welsh or whatever.
Welsh, Scottish, Irish.
Yeah. So the Welsh are really Britons.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And the English aren't really Britons at all. We're
right. Yeah.
Roman or Anglo-Saxon or wherever. And so it shouldn't really, and all that has created some wonderful stories, some rich historical stories, rich legends, and rich myths. But because it changes so much, whilst part of me wants to be passionate about it, I can't be passionate about it because it is just a transition. Because in 2,000 years, this won't exist, and there'll be other stories and other cultures and other beliefs. Without sounding pessimistic on this, But so why grab onto what we've got? We record it, and
it's natural. I would say it's natural. It's like, I think there are tradition. The whole point of tradition is it's cohesive. It holds things together. And when, as you're saying, eventually all things change. This goes back to this cycle, doesn't it? There are things like strong nuclear force tries to hold everything together, and weak nuclear force eventually says it's got to go eventually. It's got to change, and it does. It's just like the mechanics of the universe is built this way. Tradition is like the strong nuclear force of culture. It holds culture together. It bonds everybody and makes them feel unified. And when I say tradition, obviously that's a large umbrella. Yeah. And then what we're going through now seems to be weak nuclear force. It's like things change. You're going to change from the caterpillar to the butterfly. There's going to be a transformation. But
transformative. That's a good word.
Yes. Yeah. And so I get that. But the strong nuclear force and weak nuclear force are mechanics in the universe, and I think tradition and change are also mechanics of culture. And in 2,000 years, you're probably right. I don't know many cultures in the world that have managed to preserve themselves over 2,000 years. China up until I'd say 100 years ago did a very good job. Christianity, yeah. What else can we think of?
Although that has transformed dramatically, but
yes, it has. And I'd say it's in the West. It seems to be on a bit of a decline.
Yes, but do people harp back? I mean, do the Welsh harp back to being they wish they were living in England 2,000 years ago?
Yeah.
Which is unlikely.
I got a question for you. The myths of King Arthur, was that an attempt? Who was one of the main monks I'm thinking of who wrote about them?
Bede wrote.
Yeah, was he attempting to create a sort of mythos for the Britons? Was that?
Yes, Bede tried to attempt to create a myth for Britain, in effect, to again create credibility for where we are now, which is what all myths are, which is what I've been saying about creation myths of Europe. He was just trying to say the reason we're here is because of this backstory. Backstory is a load of old tosh, like rubbish. Where you got Hengist and Horsa, who are again mythical divine twin type things, to where Britons came from Troy or whatever. Some weird, strange story because that's based on Noah's Ark, and one of Noah's children came to Europe to populate it. But yes, it just is a way of establishing credibility for where we are now. That's all he was trying to do.
You don't think there was an essence where they were trying to gather, because they wouldn't have known that their myths came from, say, because we know, for instance, that Danu, the river goddess in Celtic mythology, came from the Danube. Is that right? That it takes us back to that.
There may be etymology in the names.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know whether I could say they have a common origin in terms of that river created that god, or that god created the name of that river. I'm not sure.
I seem to remember reading the idea that the migration of the Celts as they moved throughout Europe, that there was a link from Danu to the Danube. But anyway, that point being that they wouldn't have known these things, would they? They'd just known where they were. There were stories in the local.
They wouldn't even know they were Celts.
Yes.
Such were.
That's true. Yeah.
And this is what people forget. Really blows my mind is that, when people talk about these cultures and these changes, there's often hundreds of years between some of the things we're talking about, with language changes, beliefs change, technology changes. Things are just so different. You can't recreate a single capture of everything at once. You're going to have to leave something out. You're going to have to miss something, or you're going to have to get something wrong. So it's odd that we have this passion to want to retain this culture and tradition in a way. Remember you're Welsh, or I'll try to remember I'm English, whatever that means. But in effect, we can never really do that, because we can never capture the entirety of our history in one thing.
I think it's quite sad. I was listening the other day about a news article about the Cockneys in London and how they've all migrated out of London to the point where there's no that culture. When you think of, I know it sounds so cheesy.
You can't live within the sound of Bow Bells because it's too expensive.
Yeah. It's a shame. It just feels like you're losing something. But change brings in a whole new idea. I was just thinking, by the way, I'm doing a bit of a bead. If I'm trying to create a myth, and I'm sort of trying to there is a different goal with what I'm doing. I'm trying to create a universal myth, not for a culture, but for the whole world. So I'm trying to create one that's sort of so universal that it's applicable to all people. So it's not, say, culturally specific to the Indo-Europeans or Africa. It's trying to sort of be as universal as possible, which what myths try to be. It connect all people. So that's shifting away from trying to make it a cultural thing. But just to get back, because we're getting a good hour and 20 minutes in now, so I want to do this one last point I wouldn't mind touching upon before we finish, which is we started with the Big Bang and about creation, and then I started to mention about we talked about the creation myths themselves. I proposed to you, especially with the myth I was mentioning just earlier about the egg of creation, that when you look at many of the world's myths, especially the ones that developed later about certain gods dying and their bodies becoming the entire cosmos, or a god cracking an egg open and creating the entire cosmos,
a material creation of the world rather than a
when you follow that story, very often it's you can put it parallel to the cosmological story of the Big Bang, as scientists have put it. So I'm going to try my best now to show you how you can actually map them onto each other. And there's a little bit of a synergy. There's a bit of harmony. They kind of, I think they quite work well.
For those who are watching this, Simon has just tried to explain this in Leonard's way twice, and it's so complicated, it's blown our minds. And we'll probably have a whole podcast dedicated to Simon explaining this with paper models, which are fascinating, by the way.
Yes.
And explanation of physics. But let's wrap this up. In a way, the myths of the universe starting can be analogous to the way the universe actually started. Some people see that. Is that right?
Yes. I certainly do.
Okay, so, and is that a coincidence? Or is there something deep within our mind, our consciousness, that makes that?
Well, I think our ancestors intuited it by looking at things metaphorically. I think they saw patterns in nature and they were able to sort of extrapolate from those patterns an idea of a beginning, and somehow poetically, I think they divined an understanding of the Big Bang the way scientists did many thousands of years later. Again, they see it cyclically, And the many Big Bang model experts don't necessarily see it as a cycle, although Roger Penrose does. And I think, I mean, if it's proven it is cyclical, then it means our ancestors were on the money. It means our ancestors were pretty good at intuiting it. Yeah, some of it. Yes. Some of it I will try to prove in the next episode.
Exactly. Looking forward.
I will try to show you the way I think it could be mapped. It's just so complicated. I think I need to boil it down, practice it a few times, and then present it to you.
Fantastic. I'm a little skeptical. I mean, but
yeah, fine.
I'm looking forward to that. So on that note, everyone, I hope you enjoyed your tea and your mushrooms and the myths. And Simon, any last words?
I'm just going to have to take some mushrooms and think this one through.
Well, I'll just drink tea and I'll wait for the next conversation. Take care, everyone.
Brilliant. Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.
To the pip.